Reasons why Sheriff Thurmond Fowler is the worst sheriff. 1. He makes everything personal. A sheriff's cardinal sin. Law enforcement must separate emotion from duty. Fowler does not. He openly resents Russ for ruining his brother financially. He claims he doesn't blame Russ, then 30 seconds later says the opposite. He switches between polite professionalism and passive-aggressive bitterness. His tone with Russ is condescending, moralizing, and loaded with judgment. This isn't policing, it's personal vendetta disguised as wisdom. And the worst part? Russ never guaranteed the stock would succeed. Fowler's brother is a grown adult who made a financial decision. And yet Fowler treats Russ like a criminal for simply being a broker. That is unprofessional beyond belief. 2. He lets his personal hatred skew the investigation. When Russ returns to town, everyone already hates him, including Fowler. Even though Fowler pretends to be neutral, his body language and tone scream, "I think you're guilty because I don't like you." This is a massive red flag. A sheriff should evaluate evidence, not reputation. But Fowler evaluates vibes, rumors, and small-town resentment. He's not objective. He's not neutral. He's not actively policing. He's emotionally participating in the town's prejudice. 3. When Russ reports threats, Fowler does nothing. This is the worst moment for Fowler. Russ does exactly what a citizen is supposed to do. He comes forward. He reports threats. He asks for police protection. He seeks official guidance. And what does Fowler do? He shrugs. He philosophizes. He plays moral grandpa instead of sheriff. He doesn't. File a report. Recommend protection. Investigate the threatening calls. Gather evidence. Question suspects. Treat Russ like an actual citizen with rights. Fowler's response is essentially, well, good luck with that. This alone makes him an incompetent law officer. 4. He practices passive policing, which is worse than corrupt policing. Active corruption is at least predictable. But Fowler practices something far more dangerous: institutional passivity. He waits for things to happen instead of preventing them. This is why small-town corruption thrives. No one stops it, least of all Fowler. And when he finally decides to act, it's way too late. It's almost like Russ becoming corrupt is justified due to the simple fact that Fowler was too useless to even help. Russ and Delaine become villains later, but the soil for their transformation came from a corrupt, resentful town, a sheriff who refused to act, personal grudges overriding justice, zero proactive policing, a culture of moral laziness and denial. Fowler isn't the antagonist, but he might as well be. Sometimes the villains in the story aren't really the villains. Sometimes it's the hero. He's the failure state of the entire town, the symbol of a lawman who abdicated his role so thoroughly that the darkness filled the vacuum. The town didn't fall because of Russ and Delaine. It fell because the sheriff wasn't strong enough to stop anything. In The Minute You Wake Up Dead and the My Bloody Valentine 2009 film, the sheriffs who should provide that grounding instead become the emotional weak points that let their towns collapse inward. Sheriff Thurmond Fowler and Sheriff Axel Palmer are strikingly different men, but their flaws mirror each other so precisely that they form a perfect study in failed leadership. One is passive to the point of negligence, the other aggressive to the point of irrationality. Together, they represent opposite ends of the same catastrophic spectrum. Lawmen whose emotions invalidate their authority, turning them into catalysts of the very corruption and violence they should be preventing. So let's go through this again for comparison's sake. Sheriff Fowler, presented as a calm, moral, almost grandfatherly figure, is, in truth, deeply compromised by his own resentments. His interactions with Russ Potter reveal a man who cannot separate personal grievance from professional duty. Fowler blames Russ for his brother's financial ruin, a loss resulting from a stock investment that was never guaranteed. Something any rational adult, let alone a seasoned sheriff, should understand. Yet Fowler couches his bitterness in condescending civility, pretending not to blame Russ while contradicting himself moments later. This quiet duplicity is far more dangerous than open hostility. Fowler becomes a sheriff who investigates based on small-town rumor, personal resentment, and moral judgment instead of evidence. When Russ reports being threatened, exactly what any citizen should do, Fowler dismisses him with philosophical platitudes instead of action. He files no report, asks no questions, and takes no protective measures. His inaction is not mere oversight. It is a conscious choice rooted in the belief that Russ deserves the trouble that comes his way. Axel Palmer, by contrast, is emotionally volatile from the outset. In My Bloody Valentine, Axel's interrogation of Tom Hanniger is a masterclass in unprofessionalism. He becomes aggressive, accusatory, and even physically violent, not because evidence points to Tom, but because the conversation touches his jealousy and insecurity over Sarah. Axel cannot tolerate emotional discomfort. He weaponizes his badge the moment the suspect pokes his wounded pride. His personal life bleeds into his work, from his marriage infidelity to his territorial resentment, and every decision he makes is driven by these festering emotions rather than investigative logic. The tragedy lies in the fact that Axel happens to be correct about Tom in the end. But being accidentally right does not retroactively justify an emotional meltdown masquerading as police work. His correctness is luck, not competence. If Fowler represents decay through passivity, Axel represents decay through force. Fowler allows corruption to grow by doing nothing. Axel feeds corruption by trying to suppress it with brute emotional power. Both men allow their personal hatred to dictate how they treat the central outsider. Russ, in Fowler's case, Tom, in Axel's. Both towns quickly adopt their sheriff's emotional stance as social policy. In each film, the community already despises the returning outsider, and the sheriff, the one man meant to rise above prejudice, indulges in those same biases. Their lack of neutrality is not merely unprofessional, it is structurally catastrophic. The tone set by a sheriff defines how a small town interprets danger, guilt, and justice. A sheriff who hates creates a town that hates. A sheriff who fears confrontation creates a town that avoids truth. In both films, the rot spreads downward from the badge. What makes these portrayals especially troubling is that the films, consciously or not, position the sheriffs as sympathetic or at least morally acceptable figures. Fowler is framed as wise and steady, even though his negligence enables murder and psychological collapse. Axel is framed as a rough-edged hero, even though he is emotionally unstable, physically aggressive, and ethically compromised. This narrative expectation, that the audience should root for them, reveals a deeper discomfort. The films ask viewers to overlook everything that makes these men unfit for leadership simply because they occupy the archetypal position of the local sheriff. Yet viewers who pay attention sense the truth. Fowler and Axel fail, not because their towns are corrupt, but because they are. Fowler's passivity allows violence to escalate unchecked. Axel's emotional outbursts muddy investigations and worsen conflicts. Their towns are not unsafe despite them. They are unsafe because of them. They wear the same uniform, carry the same authority, and wield the same responsibility, yet neither possesses the stability, clarity, or neutrality necessary for the job. In the end, Fowler and Axel stand as some of the worst law enforcement portrayals in film history, not due to theatrical villainy, but because of their quiet, human flaws. They are weak men entrusted with powerful roles, and their internal failings become external disasters. Their towns fall into corruption, panic, and moral collapse because their sheriffs either abdicate responsibility or weaponize it. And nothing is more dangerous in a small town than a sheriff who cannot control himself, whether through poisonous restraint or explosive emotion. In The Minute You Wake Up Dead, Russ Potter is introduced as a disgraced financial advisor returning to a small southern town that once trusted him. The film initially encourages the viewer to read Russ as morally ambiguous, a man who profited off local investment losses, who may be hiding secrets, and who seems intertwined with the murky underbelly of rural life. Yet when the narrative is properly examined, Russ is not the architect of the town's unraveling. He is its scapegoat. Beneath every accusation, every condescending remark, every threatening stare, Russ emerges as the story's true victim, a man manipulated, resented, and ultimately consumed by a community that chose hatred over truth. From the outset, Russ is condemned for something that was never his crime. His investment strategies failed when the market collapsed, an outcome no broker, no matter how skilled, could have guaranteed against. Yet Sheriff Fowler and the townspeople interpret this financial downturn as a moral one. They treat Russ as though he deliberately schemed to ruin lives, even though the losses stemmed from volatile markets, not malicious design. This resentment becomes the lens through which every action Russ takes is distorted. In their eyes, he is not a man who made a mistake. He is a villain who deserves to be punished. That collective judgment creates the conditions for Russ's downfall long before he makes a single misstep. The sheriff's treatment of Russ is the clearest example of this prejudice. Sheriff Fowler never hides his bitterness, even when he tries to mask it in politeness. He blames Russ for his brother's financial ruin, a blame rooted not in evidence but in emotional injury. When Russ does the responsible thing and reports receiving threats, Fowler dismisses him with casual indifference, offering no protection, no investigation, and no concern for his safety. A law enforcement officer who truly believed in justice would have taken those threats seriously. Instead, Fowler sees Russ's danger as karmic payment. Thus, even the one figure meant to uphold fairness views Russ through a lens of punishment rather than empathy. Russ is also the victim of small-town psychology, a community that turns hostility into culture. When he returns, the townspeople treat him as a contagion. Their anger simmers in every interaction, every stare, every hushed conversation. This collective resentment isolates Russ so thoroughly that he becomes an emotional outcast, left without support or allies. It is this isolation that makes him vulnerable to manipulation, especially from Delaine Moore. She sees the void around Russ and steps into it with calculated softness, drawing him into her orbit at the exact moment when he is least capable of resisting. His vulnerability is not weakness. It is the natural result of abandonment. He becomes a man who reacts because he has no safe space left to act. And while he does make morally questionable decisions later in the story, those decisions are shaped by fear, manipulation, and desperation, not cruelty or ambition. Unlike Fowler, he does not resent. Unlike the town, he does not scapegoat others to soothe his own conscience. Russ is the only major character who never weaponizes another person. That alone distinguishes him as the story's most fundamentally human figure. By the film's end, Russ is destroyed by forces that were set against him from the beginning. A corrupt town culture, a resentful sheriff, a manipulative lover, and a narrative that condemns him before understanding him. He becomes the perfect tragic figure, misunderstood, sabotaged, and ultimately undone, not by his own sins, but by the sins projected onto him. Russ Potter is the true victim of The Minute You Wake Up Dead, Not because he is flawless, but because he is the only character who suffers for mistakes he did not commit. He is framed by circumstance, judged by assumptions, and devoured by a community hungry for someone to blame. In a story driven by deceit, resentment, and manipulation, Russ alone reflects the consequences of a world where perception overwhelms truth. He is a man who tries to protect himself and instead becomes the easiest target. In this sense, the tragedy is not merely what happens to Russ, it is that the world refuses to see his humanity until it is too late. Stories like Russ exposes a truth most people don't want to acknowledge. Sometimes the villain is simply the person society decided to blame. Russ wasn't evil, reckless, or malicious. He was a man crushed beneath a town's prejudice, a sheriff's resentment, and a manipulator's schemes. His downfall wasn't born from personal corruption, but from being cornered by a community that needed someone to punish. People like him don't become dark out of choice. They are shaped by environments that refuse to give them compassion, clarity, or fairness. Society often creates its own villains by isolating, misunderstanding, or scapegoating individuals who never sought harm. And that's why characters like Russ resonate.